Our first guest is the executive director of AAPI Victory Alliance and was previously with AAPI's Victory Fund, Varun Nikore. I hope I'm saying your last name right.
You got
correct? I got it. Yes. Varun, thanks for joining the show. I wanted to talk to you about really what's happening in the South right now and what kind of court decisions and moves by the courts to basically not, we all see what's happening in Georgia with redistricting plans and different parts of the country right now with redistricting plans to stifle votes and to the tax on voting rights. But how is this specifically affecting the AAPI community?
Yeah, so I think what the folks on the right saw in the 2020 election was this massive turnout of all people of color who came out and voted, many for the first time ever. And in past years, our community really wasn't targeted, specifically. We weren't reached out to by campaigns. And thus, if there was any voting restrictions, the Republicans could be very creative about coming up with. Our community really wasn't targeted. But that all changed in 2020. They saw this massive surge of voters in places like Georgia, in places like Arizona, which, if you look at the South and the Sun Belt, those are the fastest growing states in the country. And particularly for AAPIs, we tend to be in all those Southern and Sun Belt states, the fastest growing segments of the population. So when 2020 hit, they saw that, AAPIs are starting to vote, whereas they weren't before. Let's double down on the voting restrictions that they had already proposed in years past, targeted at other people of color, but now thinking about how we restrict the rights of AAPIs to vote as well.
So it's really because of the voting patterns and have changed. It's not because there's a new wave of immigrants coming to or to this country, or that there's a generation that's growing up the way Dreamers are now of age to vote, and there's discussion over granting Dreamers citizenship. So this really is just about voting habits.
It is. I mean, so the AAPI community has been the fastest growing population in this country since 2000.
Wow.
And that is expected to increase. There was a little bit of a, let's call it a pandemic or COVID lull in immigration amongst all communities, in 2020 or so. But we're expecting that to rise even further going forward in terms of our community's growth, simply because this country has a labor shortage, right? The unemployment rate as of last week was 3.6%. And where are we going to get all of these workers in the future? They're going to come, for the most part, from places that they've come from historically already. And that's going to be, Asia and the Pacific Islands.
So what are they doing specifically in these different states? Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina. How are they going about this legally?
Well, several things, right? So the voting restrictions that they are trying to enact were, in many cases, enacted in 2000 because of the pandemic, right? They, a lot of legislatures made it easier to vote, right? So they would have mail drop-off boxes. They would allow a little bit more flexibility in terms of, registering to vote and voting online or from home, right? And so most of those restrictions, which a lot of people of color took advantage of, and certainly APIs did, they are now clawing back and making it harder. They're trying to impose, in many cases, additional voter ID requirements, right? And so it's all of these things that were in some ways started in Georgia, and then much like we've seen in other arenas on reproductive justice and other areas, they are now starting to come up with, they're taking the Georgia laws and cookie cuttering them in Arizona, in Texas, in Pennsylvania, and in North Carolina to the degree that they can. And so we've seen this repeated pattern because they know what the trends are, right? There's a shrinking number of white people in this country, and what's growing are people of color. And so there's only one path to victory for Republicans in the future, and that is to restrict the rights of AAPIs and other people of color in voting.
And at the Supreme Court level, what's the positioning been when it's gone up the ladder and these decisions have been challenged?
Well, we won some and we've lost some,
Mm-hmm.
but the bottom line is that we need to protect the rights of all Americans to vote in free and fair elections, right? So what's the genesis of all these voting rights restrictions? It was not only the surge of voters that happened, but it's because of the big lie that the folks on the right, particularly Donald Trump, had said, oh, all these elections that he lost in Arizona and Georgia, and even places where he didn't lose, he is essentially, saying that that there was some shenanigans going on. And frankly, the only shenanigans that were really going on were amongst Republicans, right? It was his own chief of staff that voted twice in an election, that voted in a place that he wasn't even registered to vote. So that's the irony of all this. But of course, folks on the right continue to perpetrate these lies and the misinformation and disinformation, and once again trying to restrict the rights of all voters. And unfortunately, the politics of this all has now reached the highest court in our land. Of course, you can do a whole nother segment, and maybe you already have, on Ginny Thomas and Clarence Thomas.
Oh, every day I wake up, I'm like, oh, another story. This is great. Reminds me of that one you're talking about, voting twice. There's our friends over at the Good Liars got this woman on camera a few years ago. It was really funny, where she was protesting voter fraud. And they got her to admit that she did once try to vote twice, but she was a felon, so she couldn't. So they don't even realize when they're doing it. I want to also touch on, like, are these attacks, are they being explicit about targeting? I mean, sometimes they are explicit about their intentions. Are they being explicit about targeting not just immigrants, but the AAPI community?
Yeah, I think too, right, the API community, approximately 30 to 35% of APIs are limited English proficient, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were living in a society where you really wanted all people to vote, you would put voting information in multiple languages. Well, in certain cases, there's been some restrictions on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You would allow a person who maybe was more proficient in English walk in with a person who wasn't, and in certain cases, they've tried to restrict those rights as well. So on the margins, right, this clamps down on, frankly, a lot of people who would vote for Democrats. When you add those systemic and structural barriers, it makes it harder for all of us, to vote. And you don't want that impediment. You want to make it easy. You want to make it stress-free. You want to make it intimidation-free. And that's not what's happening right now in a lot of these Republican states that have Republican legislatures.
And knowing this, I'm not sure if they've been like so direct yet, but the AAPI community has been targeted during the pandemic, and a lot of this is due to for President Trump's rhetoric that is just over the top. I'm wondering if there's like any sort of if it's playing together in any way.
Yeah, it really has been. And sort of the downside of all the rhetoric we see every day, the violence all across our land, perpetrated primarily against East Asians, and in some cases, South Asians, particularly Sikh Americans, who are unfortunately walking billboards, right? That, come attack me because I'm different, right?
Right.
And so but what this has led to, quite frankly, is in the 2020 election, it led to the highest increase in engagement of any demographic in the history of our country, right? Wow. There was a 46% increase in voting, 47% increase in voting between 2016 and 2020 amongst the API community. That has not happened before in any instance that I can find ever recorded in the history of our country, where you increase your vote, any demographic increase their vote by that much in one election
It's
cycle.
incredible.
So what Trump did inadvertently was not only increase our voting and our reliability for voting for Democrats, but he has created a movement like we have never seen in this country. The term Asian American was coined in the late 70s. There was a mini movement at that time when it was around the time of Black solidarity, Black power, and Latino power as well. But that moment and that movement didn't last but a year or two. But this moment and movement that we're in today is, I believe, much more sustaining and will have net benefit for the nation, net benefit for Democrats going forward because of the vicious rhetoric that was coming out of Donald Trump and his administration's mouth on a daily basis during his presidency.
You're also involved in supporting, folks who are running from the AAPI community. Is there an increase in number of candidates running?
Since 2016, there has been a vast increase, not only in the number of AAPIs, but the number of women running in this country. And that's so gratifying because, of course, APIs, women are all underrepresented. All people of color are underrepresented in the halls of Congress and in city councils and school boards, right? And so the good, sort of the positive of the last, 6 years, if you will, is that you see more of this dynamic shifting. And in fact, our organization, the API Victory Alliance, just last week announced the first ever national endorsement process of folks who are at the state and local level.
Oh, great.
Right. And so a lot of times in politics, as you know, all the attention is paid on Congress, right? The flashy, glitzy elections of Congress and Senate. And that's important. It's important that we have majorities there. But for us to have true empowerment, we really need it at the state and local level. If we can get it at that bottom of the pyramid, then that naturally means over time you will have more people of color and APIs and women in office by virtue of just creating a large base at the very bottom.
And it can happen very quickly too. I mean, over time is within a decade, under a decade. It would be helpful if the Democrats, the Democratic Party, thought that it was worth investing in states too. Just an idea to put out there.
Novel concept.
Shouldn't have to put all the burden on all the groups outside of the party to do so. With that being said, though, are there who's handling all these legal efforts right now? Who, when there's a redistricting situation, like in so many of these different states, who's there to represent you?
So I think the tip of the spear in many cases is the Eric Holder-led effort, the National Redistricting Legislative Committee, but it's really the folks in the states that are running point on a day-to-day basis. And so those are progressive groups. They're groups that are aligned as part of the America Votes table and other local tables. There are local funders in every state that are monitoring the issues. But there are the national groups, like I mentioned, the Eric Holder's group as well, that are really doing great work in terms of the legal arena, ensuring that we don't let up on any legal fights, that we contest every legal battle that we are allowed to contest. And so that, I think, has really helped us, because I think about a year ago, even a year and a half ago, a lot of folks on our side looked at 2022 and said Democrats were going to be decimated simply by virtue of we weren't controlling where a lot of the legislative maps were going to be drawn. Because if you don't own the state legislators, rather, you don't control the redistricting process. But here we are today, and now many analysts are saying, wow, this is the best possible outcome that we could have had in many cases. And so from by virtue of the way that the state maps are drawn, we actually have a little bit of wind at our back. Now, we don't have, unfortunately, with the amount of inflation in our economy and the fact that wages have certainly risen, but inflation maybe has grown a little bit faster. Unfortunately, we've got the national mood to contend with and not a lot of time to turn that around. So we still have a big battle ahead, but I think all is not lost, especially if we out-organize the right, which is what we've been doing, frankly, for the last 6 years. We just have to continue to fight this year as well.
And you don't control Fox News either. 'Cause
That's right.
I just finished up over there, and the most important news of the day is Hunter Biden, by the way. Didn't know if you knew.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
You can't control that either.
A noun, a verb, and Hunter Biden is what they like to do, right?
What was that? The noun and
Right.
verb? Yeah.
Yes.
I was trying to keep track of their logic. It was like one of those maps where there's a string here and there's another string here, and then this is connected to that. They led with the proof is that Joe Biden once wrote a letter of recommendation for one of Hunter's friend's sons to go to college.
This so-called smoking gun.
That's it. That's it. Bring the Republicans back. That's why.
Right. Exactly.
Oh my God. Yeah, there's a lot of work. And we're always playing defense, unfortunately. And it's not easy because it affects people's lives and their material interests. Really fascinating conversation. I would love for you to keep in touch with us about any other developments that might be happening or any work you're doing or any great candidates to feature, because it really does take a lot of organizing to be able to do this work. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. Look forward to being back with you.
Thank you. Varun Nikore, who is the executive director of AAPI Victory Alliance. Go check them out. Are you joining us on all the podcast platforms? If you want to go even further, we have a very special podcast that we release on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. There's all different levels, as you know. And when you support us on Patreon, it helps us put together the other stuff. It helps us have a show. We have all different types of levels. And of course, you can get swag. You can go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show.